At 18, she was given to a mountain man for being too fat. But he had shocking plans. The dust of the frontier swirls as a father trades away his daughter in front of a laughing crowd. A girl, shamed in a tight, torn dress, is pushed toward a scarred man of the mountains, but instead of claiming her like property, he stuns the town with words no one expected. Out in the wilderness, far from the jeers, she begins to see his true intent, teaching her to fight, to stand, to live with dignity. Yet whispers of water rights, flames in the night, and enemies who will stop at nothing cast a shadow across their cabin. Even her own kin turns against her. But when she finally steps forward, stronger than anyone believed, was she given away in shame or chosen by God for something greater? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the hazy light of late autumn, dust motes swirled in the Colorado air as Eleanor May stumbled down the rutted main street. Her father's iron grip on her arm left no room for dignity. The worn dress, several sizes too small, pulled tight across her body as she tried to keep her footing in the uneven dirt. Samuel May's breath reeked of cheap whiskey as he yanked her forward. "Keep moving, girl," he growled, his voice carrying the rough edge that had become all too familiar since Ma died. The townsfolk began gathering, drawn by the spectacle like vultures to carrion. Eleanor's cheeks burned as she recognized faces: Josh Turner from the Mercantile, the widow Wilson who sometimes gave her extra eggs, ranch hands she'd seen at church. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. "Ain't nothing to feed her with anymore," Samuel announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Too many failed crops, too many lean times." He gestured at Eleanor with his free hand. "Takes too much to keep her fed. Time she became someone else's burden." Laughter rippled through the gathering crowd. Eleanor fixed her gaze on her scuffed boots, willing herself not to cry. She'd known this day was coming, had seen it in her father's cold eyes and heard it in his bitter mumblings. But the reality of being displayed like livestock at auction made her stomach churn. They reached the weather-beaten porch of the Red Creek Saloon. The wooden planks creaked under their feet as Samuel pushed her forward. More onlookers spilled out of the batwing doors, the reek of stale beer and tobacco smoke mixing with the autumn air. "Who'll take her?" Samuel called out, his voice carrying down the street. "Strong back for work, if nothing else. Too fat to feed, but might be worth something to the right buyer." The words cut deeper than any knife. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, trying to become smaller, to disappear into the rough boards beneath her feet. But there was nowhere to hide from the cruel laughter and crueler words that followed. "Might need 2 horses to pull that load," someone called out, triggering fresh guffaws. "Could feed a family all winter," another voice added. Eleanor's vision blurred with unshed tears. These were people she'd known all her life, neighbors who'd shared pews at church, traded goods at market, helped during harvest. Now they stood witness to her shame, adding their own barbs to her father's cruelty. The crowd parted suddenly, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Silas Boone. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, his broad shoulders and towering height making others step back instinctively. A long scar ran down the left side of his face, disappearing into his beard, and his eyes held the watchful alertness of a man used to surviving in the wilderness. The laughter died away as Silas approached the porch. Eleanor had heard whispers about him, the mountain man who trapped in the high country, who came to town only to trade furs and the supplies. Some said he'd lost his family to fever years ago. Others claimed he'd always been a loner. All agreed he was a man to be respected, if not feared. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his gaze moving from Samuel to Eleanor. There was no mockery in his eyes, no cruel amusement, only a quiet assessment that made Eleanor stand a little straighter despite her shame. "I'll take her," Silas said, his voice deep and steady as mountain bedrock. Samuel's grip on Eleanor's arm tightened. "What's your offer?" Without hesitation, Silas unslung the rifle from his shoulder, a fine Winchester repeater, well-maintained despite its obvious years of use. "This," he said, "and 2 sacks of flour from my wagon." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The rifle alone was worth more than most men saw in months of work. Eleanor felt her father's fingers twitch against her arm as he calculated the value. "Done," Samuel said quickly, before anyone else could speak up. Silas nodded once, then turned to his wagon. The crowd parted again as he retrieved 2 heavy sacks of flour, carrying them easily up the porch steps. He set them down, then carefully placed the rifle in Samuel's eager hands. Eleanor expected to be grabbed, to be handled like the property she'd just become. Instead, Silas turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I take her as partner," he declared, "not possession." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest as she processed their meaning. Partner? Not servant, not slave, not burden, but partner? Someone in the crowd snickered, but a sharp look from Silas silenced them. He turned to Eleanor, and for the first time that day, someone spoke to her directly, treating her as a person rather than a thing to be disposed of. "My wagon's there," he said, gesturing to a well-maintained freight wagon at the hitching post. "If you're willing." Eleanor glanced at her father, but Samuel was already examining his new rifle, testing its action with the eagerness of a child with a new toy. He didn't even look up as she took her first unsteady step toward freedom. The wooden steps creaked under her feet as she descended. Each step felt like moving through deep water, her legs heavy and uncertain. The crowd's presence pressed against her like a physical weight, their whispers and stares following her movement. Silas waited patiently at the bottom of the steps, neither hurrying nor helping her. This simple act of allowing her to move under her own power, to make her own choice, struck Eleanor more powerfully than any grand gesture could have. The distance to the wagon seemed both endless and too short. Eleanor's mind whirled with questions and fears. Who was this man really? What would her life become? Was this truly an offer of partnership? Or would the truth prove darker once they were away from town? Yet with each step, she felt something else growing alongside her fear. A tiny, fragile spark of hope. Silas's words echoed in her mind. Partner, not possession. In all her life, no one had ever offered her such dignity, such respect. As she reached the wagon, Eleanor heard the saloon doors swing open behind her. Through the corner of her eye, she saw her father disappearing into the darkness within, rifle in hand, not even pausing for a final look at his only daughter. Silas stepped forward then, not to grab or push, but simply to steady the wagon as Eleanor climbed aboard. Her too-tight dress made the simple action a challenge, but she managed it without assistance, settling onto the wooden seat with as much grace as she could muster. The crowd began to disperse. Their entertainment concluded. Some still whispered and pointed, but Eleanor forced herself to sit straight, to not shrink from their gaze. She was leaving them behind, their judgment, their cruelty, their narrow world of spite and mockery. Silas climbed up beside her, gathering the reins in his capable hands. He didn't speak, didn't try to fill the heavy silence with empty words or false promises. Instead, he simply clicked to the horses, and the wagon began to move. The heavy wheels crunched through the dirt as they pulled away from the saloon. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back at the town that had witnessed her deepest humiliation. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her heart pounded with uncertainty about what lay ahead. But beneath the fear and shame, that small spark of hope continued to glow. Partner, not possession. The words had changed everything, not erasing the pain of this day, but offering something she'd never dared to dream of, the chance to be seen as a person of worth. As they reached the edge of town, Eleanor felt the autumn wind against her face, carrying with it the scent of pine from the distant mountains. She didn't know what waited for her in those mountains, what life she would build with this quiet, strong man beside her. But for the first time in years, she felt something that had nothing to do with her size, or her father's cruelty, or the town's mockery. She felt the first fragile stirrings of dignity. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as they made their way out of town, each rotation taking Eleanor further from everything she'd known. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rutted dirt road, and a chill wind whipped at her skirts. She sat rigidly on the wooden seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap, fighting the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. Beside her, Silas Boone maintained a steady silence. He handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding the mule team along the winding path that led toward the distant mountains. The only sounds were the jingling of harness, the creak of leather, and the steady clip-clop of hooves against packed earth. Eleanor stole glances at him from the corner of her eye, His profile was sharp against the darkening sky, the scar on his face catching the fading light. His expression remained unreadable, focused on the road ahead. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, but it wasn't the cruel silence she was used to from her father. This felt different, patient, perhaps, or simply accepting. As dusk began to settle over the land, Silas guided the wagon off the main road and into a meadow sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. The grass was tall here, gone golden with autumn, and a small creek bubbled nearby. He brought the wagon to a stop with a gentle word to the mules. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, his voice low and steady. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd left town. Eleanor watched as he moved with efficient grace, unhitching the mules and seeing to their comfort before turning to make camp. He gathered wood and built a fire with practiced hands, the flames soon dancing in the growing darkness. The familiar scent of wood smoke filled the air, and Eleanor found herself drawn closer to its warmth as the evening chill deepened. From the wagon, Silas produced a cast-iron skillet and simple provisions: beans, salt pork, and cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. He set about preparing the meal without fuss, his movements sure and economical. Eleanor stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of her place or what was expected of her. When the food was ready, Silas divided it onto 2 tin plates. Eleanor's eyes widened as he handed her the larger portion without comment or expectation. She stared at the plate in her hands, thrown off balance by this simple act of consideration. In her father's house, she had grown used to taking the smallest share, to going hungry more often than not. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Eleanor tried to eat slowly, to show proper manners despite her hunger, but the food was good and filling. When she finished, she set the plate aside carefully, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." Silas nodded in acknowledgement, then rose to tend to the fire for the night. He returned to the wagon and brought out 2 quilts, offering one to Eleanor. It was well worn but clean, smelling faintly of cedar. "You can sleep there," he said, indicating a spot near the fire. "I'll be over here." He gestured to a place several feet away, where he laid out his own bedroll, his rifle placed within easy reach. Eleanor wrapped herself in the quilt, but sleep was long in coming. She shivered, partly from the autumn night's chill, but more from the uncertainty of her situation. Everything about this day felt dreamlike and strange. Silas's quiet courtesy was more unsettling than cruelty would have been. She knew how to handle cruelty, had learned its patterns at her father's hands. But this gentle respect was foreign territory. Through the night, she drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, aware of Silas's solid presence across the fire. He remained still, but she sensed he was alert even in rest, like a wolf watching over its territory. The moon tracked across the sky, stars wheeled overhead, and gradually the eastern horizon began to lighten. Morning brought frost that sparkled on the meadow grass like scattered diamonds. Eleanor woke fully to find Silas already up and moving about the camp. He had rebuilt the fire and set coffee to boil in a battered pot, the rich aroma mixing with the crisp morning air. She watched as he went to tend to the mules. His scarred hands, capable of wielding an axe or rifle with deadly skill, moved with surprising gentleness as he brushed down the animals and checked their hooves. He spoke to them in low tones, and the mules responded to his touch with obvious trust. This tender care for the creatures under his protection stirred something in Eleanor's chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. After a breakfast of coffee and the remaining cornbread, they broke camp and returned to the road. The mountains loomed closer now, their peaks sharp against the morning sky. Eleanor watched them grow larger as the wagon rolled steadily onward, until finally the question that had burned in her mind since yesterday could no longer be contained. "What?" she began, then had to clear her throat to continue. "What do you expect of me?" Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead, but she saw him consider the question carefully before answering. When he spoke, his voice was even and direct. "To stand beside me, nothing more." The simple words hit Eleanor like a physical force. She had braced herself for demands, for conditions, for the revelation of hidden cruelty. This straightforward declaration of partnership was more devastating than any harshness could have been. It stripped away her defenses, leaving her raw and uncertain. The wagon continued its steady progress toward the mountains, wheels turning against the rutted earth. Eleanor sat in silence, turning Silas's words over in her mind. To stand beside him. Not behind, not beneath, but beside. The concept was as vast and challenging as the mountains themselves. She watched his profile against the morning sky, trying to understand this man who had purchased her freedom with a rifle and flower, only to offer her dignity in return. His scars spoke of a hard life, yet his hands could be gentle. His silence was not meant to intimidate but seemed to create space for her to find her own footing. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and burning away the last of the frost. Ahead, the mountain road began its slow ascent into territory unknown to Eleanor. She did not know what waited at the end of this journey, but Silas's words echoed in her mind. To stand beside me. Nothing more, nothing less. Such a simple statement, yet it contained multitudes. It offered both challenge and promise, respect and expectation. It suggested a future she had never dared to imagine, one where she might be valued for more than what she could serve or sacrifice. The wagon creaked onward, carrying them both, toward whatever lay ahead. Eleanor's hands slowly unclenched in her lap as the miles passed beneath the wheels. She was not at peace, not yet, but something had shifted within her. Silas's honest words had planted a seed in the fertile soil of her uncertainty. What it might grow into remained to be seen, but for now, the simple act of moving forward was enough. By midday, the flat prairie gave way to rolling foothills. The wagon wheels jolted against rocks and ruts, making Eleanor grab the wooden seat to keep her balance. Each bump sent uncomfortable waves through her body, and she struggled to find a way to sit that didn't leave her bouncing like a sack of grain. Silas handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding the mules around the worst of the rough spots. The path wound between scattered pine trees, their sharp scent filling the air. To their right, a steep slope dropped away, offering glimpses of the valley they'd left behind. Eleanor tried not to look down, focusing instead on the trail ahead. The sun had climbed high overhead when Silas pulled the wagon to a stop beside a clear mountain stream. Water tumbled over smooth rocks, the sound a welcome change from the creak and rattle of wagon wheels. "Need to water the mules," Silas said, setting the brake. He climbed down and went to the animals' heads, speaking to them softly as he led them to the stream's edge. Eleanor watched him tend to the mules, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The question that had been burning in her mind since yesterday finally found its way to her lips. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When he glanced back at her, she added, "Why did you defend me? In town?" Silas straightened from where he'd been checking one of the mule's hooves. He considered her question for a long moment, squinting against the midday Sunday. "Mocking a woman makes cowards of men," he said simply, turning back to his task. The words hung in the air between them, plain and true as river stones. They rested by the stream through the hottest part of the day, letting the mules recover their strength. Eleanor drank deeply from the cold mountain water, surprised by its sweet taste compared to the well water she was used to. "Cabin's another day's ride," Silas told her as he repacked their supplies. "We'll make camp here tonight." As evening approached, Silas showed her how to gather pine boughs for bedding. His movements were swift and efficient, breaking off the greenest branches and laying them in a pattern that would cushion them from the hard ground. Eleanor tried to copy him, but her attempts were clumsy. The branches seemed to fight her, scratching her hands and tangling in her skirts. Heat rose in her cheeks as she struggled with what should have been a simple task. Yet Silas made no comment about her awkwardness, simply continued his work until they had enough boughs for 2 sleeping places. For supper, Silas wrapped cornbread in leaves and set the packages on hot stones near the fire to warm. The moon was rising, full and bright, by the time they ate. Its silver light mixed with the golden glow of their campfire, casting long shadows among the trees. They sat in companionable silence until Silas began to speak, his voice low and measured. He shared small pieces of his life, years spent trapping in these mountains, long winters alone in his cabin, the quiet companionship of solitude. He didn't elaborate much, but Eleanor found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by these glimpses into his world. When he fell silent, Eleanor felt compelled to offer something in return. "I'm not much good at sewing," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "But I can read. And write, too." The words came out in a rush, as though she feared they might be snatched back. Silas's eyebrows rose slightly, the most surprise she'd seen him show. In the hills, Literacy was as rare as gold nuggets in a stream bed. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully, but didn't press her for more. The fire had burned low when Eleanor found herself whispering a prayer. She hadn't prayed since her mother died, and the words felt strange on her tongue, edged with doubt. But something about the vast night sky and the wilderness around them made her feel small and in need of guidance. Silas remained silent during her prayer, merely stirring the coals with a stick. The gesture seemed to Eleanor both respectful and protective, giving her privacy while maintaining a watchful presence. They made their beds on opposite sides of the fire, close enough to the stream that its gentle music would accompany their sleep. Eleanor settled onto her pine bough bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Despite the strange surroundings, she felt oddly secure. Perhaps it was the solid presence of Silas nearby, or maybe just exhaustion from the day's journey. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was the moon's reflection dancing on the stream's surface, bright and peaceful. Sleep came easier than the night before, though her dreams were filled with the sway and jolt of wagon wheels. Dawn arrived with a chorus of birdsong. Eleanor woke to find the world pearled with dew, the sunrise painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Silas was already up, tending to the mules and preparing for another day of travel. They ate a quick breakfast of the remaining cornbread, then packed up camp. As Eleanor climbed back into the wagon, she noticed her hands were scratched from gathering pine boughs. But she felt a small surge of pride. She had learned something new, however clumsily. The wagon creaked into motion, continuing its upward journey into the mountains. Eleanor watched the valley disappear behind them as they climbed higher, moving deeper into Silas's world with each turn of the wheels. The morning birds continued their songs, accompanying them as they wound their way along the mountain trails. Each mile brought them closer to Silas's cabin, and to whatever future awaited them there. Eleanor sat straighter on the wagon seat, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The next afternoon's sun hung low in the western sky when Silas guided the wagon around a final bend in the trail. Eleanor's breath caught at the sight before her. A sturdy log cabin stood in a small clearing, its weathered walls glowing amber in the slanting light. Behind it, mountains stretched endlessly upward, their peaks lost in wisps of cloud. A creek tumbled past the cabin's corner, its rushing voice a constant song against the stillness. The wilderness stretched vast and untamed in every direction. Eleanor's heart fluttered with equal parts awe and fear. This remote place seemed a world apart from the town she'd left behind, as foreign to her as the moon itself. Silas brought the wagon to a halt and helped Eleanor down. Her legs trembled from 2 days of travel, and she steadied herself against the wagon wheel. The air here was thinner, crisp with pine and wood smoke. "Home," Silas said simply, leading the way to the cabin's wooden door. It opened with a creak, revealing a single room that stretched from dirt floor to peaked roof. Golden afternoon light streamed through 2 small windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. Eleanor stood in the doorway, taking in every detail. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its chimney built of river rock. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat beneath one window. Above, accessed by a sturdy ladder, she glimpsed the edge of a loft bed. Everything spoke of careful craftsmanship, if plain and practical. "Come," Silas said, moving to show her the essentials of his home. Their home now, she supposed, with a flutter of uncertainty. He opened a cabinet built into one wall, revealing shelves lined with dried meat, preserves, and sacks of flour and beans. Another corner held neat stacks of split firewood, enough to ward off mountain winters. On a small shelf, near the hearth, a Bible lay open, its pages well worn. Eleanor's gaze lingered on it, remembering similar, quiet moments with her mother before illness took her. She tensed, waiting for Silas to start giving orders, to demand she begin cooking or cleaning like a proper wife. Instead, he gestured to the cabin's interior. "Arrange it how you please," he said quietly. "This is your home now, too." Eleanor blinked in surprise, unable to quite believe his words. She'd expected demands, not choices. Before she could respond, Silas moved to the hearth and began preparing their evening meal. She watched as he worked, his movements sure and practiced. He added vegetables and dried venison to a pot of water, seasoning it with herbs that filled the cabin with a savory aroma. As dusk gathered outside, They sat at the rough table to share the stew. The food was simple but filling, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly as warmth spread through her body. Through the windows, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Need to tell you my plan," Silas said after a while, his voice gentle but firm. Eleanor's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, her heart quickening. Here it comes, she thought, the real reason he'd brought her here. But Silas's next words scattered her fears like leaves in a wind. "Going to teach you the ways of these mountains," he said, looking at her steadily. "How to hunt, trap, read weather, build fires, cure meat, tan hides. Skills to make you strong on your own." Eleanor stared at him, bewildered. "But why?" she managed to ask. "Because every soul deserves to know their own strength," he replied simply. "You've been told you're a burden. Want to show you different." His sincerity struck her like a physical force. This wasn't the speech of a man seeking to own or control. This was something else entirely, an offer of partnership, of dignity restored through knowledge and skill. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild voices echoing off the mountainsides. The sound should have frightened Eleanor, but somehow it didn't. Instead, it seemed to speak of freedom, of possibilities she'd never dared imagine. After they'd cleaned up from supper, Silas showed her to a small alcove he'd prepared. A straw mattress lay on a raised platform, with clean blankets folded at its foot. "Your space," he said. "I'll sleep in the loft." Eleanor nodded, throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. As she settled onto the mattress that night, pulling the blankets close against the mountain chill, she found herself soothed by the creek's constant song. The sound wrapped around her like a lullaby, gentler than any she'd known since childhood. Sleep came easier than she'd expected, deep and dreamless. When dawn painted the cabin's walls with pale light, she woke to find Silas already up, stoking the fire for breakfast. After a simple meal of cornmeal mush sweetened with honey, Silas led her outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean, making Eleanor pull her shawl tighter. He stopped at a woodpile near the cabin's wall and picked up a well-worn hatchet. "First lesson," he said, holding it out to her. The tool's weight surprised Eleanor as she took it, the wooden handle smooth from years of use. Splitting wood builds both strength and patience. Start with the smaller pieces. Eleanor looked at the hatchet in her hands, then at the woodpile. This was no symbolic gesture. It was real work, useful work. Her first step toward the independence Silas had promised. She wrapped her fingers more firmly around the handle, determination replacing uncertainty. Whatever this new life held, she would face it with the same strength that had helped her survive everything else. The mountain morning stretched bright before her, full of challenge and possibility. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale stripes when Eleanor stood before the woodpile, hatchet in hand. The morning air bit sharp against her cheeks, and frost sparkled on the split logs. She lifted the tool as Silas had shown her, but her first swing went wild, barely grazing the piece of pine she'd aimed for. "Take your time," Silas said from where he leaned against the cabin wall. "Find your mark before you strike." Eleanor nodded, adjusting her grip. The wooden handle felt clumsy in her soft hands. She tried again, and this time the hatchet blade struck wood but at an angle, sticking fast without splitting the log. Heat rose to her cheeks as she struggled to free the blade. "Here," Silas stepped forward, demonstrating the motion once more. His scarred hands moved with practiced grace, the hatchet swinging in a clean arc. The log split with a satisfying crack. "Let the weight of the head do the work. Don't force it." Eleanor tried to copy his movement. Her arms trembled with the effort, and after an hour, blisters had formed on her palms. Frustration built in her chest as log after log defeated her attempts. But Silas didn't rush her or show impatience. He simply watched, offering quiet correction when needed. Finally, near mid-morning, she found the right rhythm. The hatchet fell true, and a small log split cleanly in two. The sound of success rang sweet in her ears. "Well done," Silas said simply. His approval, though quietly given, warmed her more than she expected. They moved on to other chores. Silas handed her 2 wooden buckets for hauling water from the creek. The current ran swift and cold, numbing her hands as she dipped the buckets. The walk back to the cabin left her breathing hard, water sloshing over her skirts. But she made 4 trips without complaint, determined to prove her worth. Inside the cabin, Eleanor swept the plank floor with a rough bristled broom, while Silas prepared meat for making jerky. He showed her how to slice the venison thin and even, then hang the strips on lines strung near the hearth to dry. Preserved meat sees us through winter, he explained, demonstrating how to salt each piece. Need to keep it high enough to catch the smoke, but not so close it cooks too fast. By afternoon, Eleanor's arms ached fiercely from all the new work, yet beneath the discomfort lay something else, a feeling she barely recognized. Pride. Here, each task had purpose. Each effort brought visible results. No one mocked her movements or called her useless. As evening approached, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she lifted her spoon, muscles unused to such labor protesting every movement. "You showed good persistence today," Silas said, breaking their usual quiet. "Most folks quit when blisters come." Eleanor ducked her head, unused to praise. "Thank you for your patience," she murmured. "I know I'm slow at learning." "Speed ain't what matters up here," he replied. "Just doing what needs doing, day by day." That night, Eleanor lay on her straw mattress, watching lamplight dance on the log walls. The cabin's warmth wrapped around her like a blanket, and the creek's song drifted through the window. Strange, she thought, how she felt safer here in this wild place than she ever had under her father's roof. No harsh words waited to ambush her. No bitter looks reminded her of her failings. Sleep came easy, deep and dreamless. But morning arrived too soon, with Silas gently calling her name as first light crept through the windows. After a breakfast of hot porridge, Silas announced they would check his trapline. Eleanor's muscles protested as she followed him into the forest, her feet catching on roots and rocks. The mountain air was thin, making her breath come short as they climbed. "Watch where I step," Silas advised, picking his way along a barely visible trail. Ground's treacherous when wet. Eleanor tried to match his sure-footed grace, but she stumbled often, yet Silas never showed irritation at her clumsiness. He simply waited when she fell behind, sometimes pointing out landmarks she could use to guide herself: a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive boulder, the curve of the creek. The first few traps they checked were empty, but at the fourth, they found a snowshoe hare caught in a snare. Eleanor's heart clenched at the sight of the still form. "Nothing should go to waste," Silas said quietly. He showed her how to check if the meat was still good, then demonstrated the proper way to dress the animal. "Watch close now. You'll need to know this." Eleanor's stomach churned as Silas worked, but she forced herself to observe. This was part of mountain life, part of survival. When he offered her the knife to try some of the steps herself, her hands shook, but she accepted. The work was messy and difficult. Several times she had to stop, breathing deep to settle her queasiness, but Silas's steady presence helped her continue. His quiet instructions guided her through each step. By the time they returned to the cabin, dusk was settling over the mountains. Smoke curled from the chimney where they'd banked the morning's fire. Inside, Silas showed Eleanor how to prepare the hare for roasting. "Season it light," he advised. "Let the meat's own taste come through." The aroma that filled the cabin as the hare cooked made Eleanor's mouth water, despite her earlier squeamishness. When Silas finally declared it done, she found herself eager to taste the results of their work. The meat was tender, flavored by smoke and herbs. Eleanor took small, careful bites, savoring each one. This was food she had helped provide, from forest to fire. A faint smile touched her lips as she realized how much had changed in just 2 days. "Good?" Silas asked, noting her expression. Eleanor nodded, surprising herself with her answer. "Very good," she said softly. It wasn't just the taste she meant, but everything: the honest work, the patient teaching, the sense that she might actually belong in this strange new life. Silas seemed to understand. He simply nodded and continued eating, letting comfortable silence fill the cabin as night gathered outside. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his beard, and Eleanor noticed how his fierce appearance contrasted with his gentle ways. Like the mountains themselves, she thought, there was more to him than first appeared. Later, as she prepared for sleep, Eleanor examined her blistered hands. They would be sore tomorrow, but she didn't mind. Each mark told a story of effort, of learning, of small victories won. She was no longer just Samuel May's burden of a daughter. Here, working beside Silas, She was becoming someone new, someone capable, someone with purpose. The creek's voice drifted through the window, its constant song both wild and soothing. Eleanor settled onto her mattress, muscles aching but spirit lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, but for the first time in her life, she looked forward to facing them. The days settled into a steady rhythm at Silas's mountain cabin. Each sunrise brought new tasks, and Eleanor found herself growing stronger, more capable. Her blisters hardened to calluses, and she learned to split wood without Silas's guidance. The creek's constant song became as familiar as her own heartbeat. One crisp afternoon, as golden autumn light filtered through the pines, Silas beckoned Eleanor to follow him down to the creek bank. The water rushed clear and swift over smooth stones, carrying the bite of mountain snow. "This creek," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm, "is the lifeblood of everything here." He crouched down, letting the cold water run through his scarred fingers. "Keeps the garden watered in summer, brings trout in spring. Without it, nothing survives." Eleanor watched the sunlight dance on the ripples, understanding dawning in her mind. This wasn't just water, it was life itself. "Problem is," Silas continued, standing slowly, "others want it too. Ranchers downstream been eyeing it for their cattle. More, come every season, pushing up into the hills." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the creek's melody. Two riders appeared around the bend, their horses' flanks dark with sweat. Eleanor recognized one as Thomas Briggs, a wealthy rancher she'd seen in town. His companion was a hard-faced man she didn't know. Silas straightened, his stance protective but not aggressive. Eleanor felt tension crackle in the air like storm lightning. "Boone," Briggs called out, his tone sharp as a knife edge. "Been meaning to have words with you about this creek." "Speak your piece, then," Silas replied evenly. Briggs shifted in his saddle, looking down at them with barely concealed contempt. "This here's ranch land now. Survey crew marked it last month. You're squatting where you ain't welcome." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand steady beside Silas. His calm seemed to flow into her, lending her strength. "Been here 15 years, Silas said. "Built every log of that cabin myself. Creek was here before any surveys, and my claim to it's as solid as the mountains." The second rider spat into the dust. "Ain't no proper claim if it ain't registered. Law's changing, mountain man. Best pack up peaceful-like while you can. Or what comes won't be peaceful," Briggs added, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Silas didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. His voice remained steady. "I know the law, know it better than you reckon. This is my home, and I ain't leaving." Eleanor found herself stepping forward, though her knees felt weak. She met Briggs's cold stare, refusing to flinch. The rancher's lip curled. "Got yourself a woman now, too? Ain't that sweet?" His tone made the words an insult. "Better think hard about her safety up here, all alone." "You heard my answer," Silas said. "Best ride on now." For a long moment, the only sound was the creek's endless flow. Then Briggs yanked his horse's head around. "This ain't finished, Boone. Not by far." They watched the riders disappear back down the trail, dust settling in their wake. Eleanor released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. Silas turned to look at her, his eyes grave. "Would be foolish not to be, but fear ain't what decides things." That evening, after a quiet supper of beans and cornbread, Eleanor gathered her courage to speak. "Silas?" Her voice sounded small in the cabin's dimness. "How secure is our claim to the creek? Truly?" He was silent for a long moment, staring into the hearth flames. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Land office in Denver's still sorting out old treaties with the tribes. New surveys conflict with homestead claims. Nothing's settled proper." Eleanor twisted her hands in her skirt, thinking hard. What about registering the creek officially?" She hesitated as Silas looked at her sharply. "I mean, filing water rights at the land office? How do you know about such things?" There was surprise in his voice, but also curiosity. Heat crept into Eleanor's cheeks. "My mother. She used to read everything she could get her hands on. Letters, almanacs, notices from town. She taught me to read them too." The memory brought both pain and pride. "I remember pieces about water laws, how they were changing with all the new settlers coming west." Silas studied her face in the firelight, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression, a deepening of respect, an acknowledgement of worth beyond physical labor. "You might be right," he said slowly. "Proper filing could help, but it means dealing with townfolk, papers, lawyers maybe." His mouth tightened. "And Briggs has friends in those circles. Money talks loud in land offices. But we have to try," Eleanor insisted, surprising herself with the force of her words. "This is our home now. We can't just wait for them to take it." The wind picked up outside, rattling the center. Shutters Silas had helped her hang just days ago. The sound seemed ominous now, like warning fingers tapping at the windows. Their little cabin, which had felt so safe and secure, suddenly seemed vulnerable against the vastness of the night and the forces gathering against them. Silas added another log to the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "You're right again," he said quietly. "We'll need to think careful about this. Plan our next move smart." Eleanor nodded, her mind already working. "I could help with the paperwork," she offered. "I write a fair hand." A ghost of a smile touched Silas's weathered face. "Reckon you're full of surprises, Eleanor May." They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low. The creek's voice drifted through the walls, precious and perpetual. Eleanor felt fear, yes, but underneath it ran a stronger current of determination. This place had already begun to heal something in her that she hadn't even known was broken. She wouldn't let it be taken without a fight. The wind moaned around the cabin's corners, and shadows danced on the rough-hewn walls. Danger might be gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, but they would face it together. Eleanor straightened her spine, remembering how far she'd come from that humiliating day in town. She was no longer helpless, no longer alone. Silas rose to bank the fire for the night, his movements deliberate and sure. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll start planning proper." Eleanor nodded, but sleep felt far away. Her mind was full of half-remembered legal phrases from her mother's readings, and her heart was heavy with the weight of the threat to their home. Yet mixed with the worry was something else, a fierce pride that Silas had listened to her suggestion, had valued her knowledge. The creek sang its endless song outside, oblivious to human disputes over its waters. Its voice had become precious to Eleanor, a lullaby of belonging. As she finally drifted toward sleep, she silently vowed to protect this place that had offered her sanctuary and purpose. Whatever came, she would stand her ground beside Silas, no longer a burden to be cast aside, but a partner ready to fight for what was right. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain cabin. Eleanor woke to the sound of Silas stoking the fire, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. He turned as she climbed down from the loft, his expression determined. "Need to ride into town today," he announced, pouring coffee into tin cups. "Get supplies and see about those water rights you mentioned." Eleanor's stomach tightened at the thought of returning to the place of her humiliation, but she nodded firmly. "I'll get ready." She chose her cleanest dress, faded blue calico that had seen better days but was still modest and proper. As she pinned up her hair, Eleanor studied her reflection in the small mirror Silas had hung by the window. Her face had changed in the weeks since leaving town. Sun and mountain air had brought color to her cheeks, and hard work had straightened her spine. She still carried extra weight, but somehow it bothered her less now. Silas hitched the mule to the wagon while Eleanor packed a simple lunch of cornbread and dried venison. The morning air nipped at their faces as they started down the mountain trail, frost crunching under the wagon wheels. "You ain't gotta come if you don't want to," Silas said quietly after they'd driven a while. Eleanor gripped her shawl tighter. "Yes, I do. This is our home now. I won't hide from people's meanness anymore." They reached town by mid-morning. The main street was busy with wagons and riders, dust rising in the cold autumn air. Eleanor felt eyes turn toward them as Silas guided the mule to the hitching post outside the general store. Whispers followed their path, but she kept her head high, remembering the strength she'd found in the mountains. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's wife stared openly, but Silas went about his business as if he noticed nothing unusual. He carefully selected supplies: 10 pounds of flour, a box of nails, several yards of cream-colored cotton cloth. Eleanor added a spool of thread to their purchases, thinking of the curtains she hoped to make. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, Eleanor spotted a familiar figure across the street. Mr. Jenkins, the agency clerk, hurrying toward his office with an armful of papers. "Silas," she said quickly, touching his arm. "The land office clerk, we should speak to him now." Silas studied her face for a moment, then nodded. They crossed the rutted street, ignoring the stares of loafers on the saloon porch. Eleanor's heart thundered as they approached the clerk's office, but she forced herself to remain calm. Mr. Jenkins looked up in surprise as they entered, his spectacles sliding down his nose. "Can I help you folks?" "Yes, sir," Eleanor said before Silas could speak. "We need to file a water claim for Creek's End Cabin, up in the North Hills." The clerk blinked, clearly startled to hear such precise terms from her. "A water claim? That's rather complicated business, miss." "We understand that," Eleanor replied steadily, "but we want to do everything proper and legal." Jenkins peered at them over his spectacles, then shrugged. "Well, I have the forms here somewhere." He began rifling through stacks of papers. While he searched, Eleanor explained about Silas's 15 years of residence and the creek's importance to their homestead. The clerk listened with increasing interest, especially when she mentioned specific water law statutes she remembered from her mother's readings. "You can read and write then?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Yes, sir. Both." "Well, that's fortunate." Jenkins pulled out several official-looking documents. "These forms need careful copying. Every detail must be exact." Eleanor settled at the clerk's spare desk, dipping a pen in ink. Her hand was steady as she carefully copied the required information. Property boundaries, water usage, dates of settlement. Silas stood quietly beside her, answering questions about the land when needed. "Sign here," Jenkins indicated finally, pointing to the bottom of the last page. Silas's signature was rough but clear. The clerk stamped the papers officially, promising to send them to the Denver office for processing. As they stepped back onto the street, Eleanor felt a mix of pride and anxiety. They'd taken the first step, but would it be enough? A throat cleared nearby. They turned to find Reverend Matthews, the town preacher, watching them with kind eyes. "Mr. Boone," he said, nodding to Silas. Then, surprisingly gentle, "Miss May, I'm glad to see you looking so well." "Thank you, Reverend," Eleanor managed, touched by his sincere tone. "The Lord blesses those who seek justice through proper channels," the preacher said meaningfully. "I hope your claim succeeds." Behind them, Eleanor heard muttering from the saloon crowd, but the Reverend's words gave her courage. She stood straighter as they returned to their wagon. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the mountains in deep purple shadows. The air had grown colder, and Eleanor's fingers were stiff as she helped Silas unload their supplies. Later, after a warm supper of beans and fresh bread, Eleanor sat by the fire with the new cloth in her lap. Her needle flashed in the lamplight as she carefully hemmed the edges for curtains. The cream-colored cotton would soften the cabin's rough windows, making the space feel more like the home it had become. Silas watched her work from his chair by the hearth, whittling a new handle for her hatchet. The comfortable silence between them was broken only by the pop of burning logs and the whisper of her needle through fabric. When she finally hung the curtains, the cabin seemed to exhale, growing somehow both cozier and more dignified. Lamplight caught the fresh cloth, casting soft shadows on the log walls. "Looks like home," Silas said quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the simple praise. She smoothed the curtain one last time, then moved to bank the fire for the night. As she did, something caught her eye through the window, white specks drifting past the glass. "Snow," she breathed, pressing close to look out. The first flakes of winter were falling silently in the darkness, dusting the ground with pale promise. Eleanor watched them dance in the lamplight, feeling strangely peaceful despite the day's tensions. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she faced them now with strength she hadn't known she possessed, and she wasn't facing them alone. She turned from the window to find Silas watching her, his scarred face softened by the firelight. Their eyes met briefly before Eleanor looked away, her heart beating faster at the warmth in his gaze. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blessing their mountain home with winter's first gentle touch. The days grew shorter as winter settled into the mountains. Snow blanketed the landscape in pristine white, transforming familiar paths into mysterious drifts. Eleanor watched through the curtained windows as more flakes drifted down, adding to the layers that already reached past her ankles. Inside the cabin, she had developed a steady rhythm to her days. The morning fire needed careful tending, and she'd learned to bank the coals just right to keep warmth through the night. Her hands, once soft from town life, grew calloused from working with wood and iron, yet she found satisfaction in the simple tasks that kept their home running. This morning, she sat cross-legged by the hearth, surrounded by Silas's worn shirts. Her needle flashed in the firelight as she mended tears and reinforced weak seams. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and the rabbit stew simmering in the iron pot. Eleanor had discovered she had a prize as law, talent for cooking, especially hearty mountain fare that stuck to the ribs on cold days. "Time you learned another skill," Silas said, setting his coffee cup down. He reached for the long rifle mounted above the door. Every mountain woman should know how to handle a gun. Eleanor's hands stilled on her mending. "I've never touched one before." "Then it's past time." His voice was gentle but firm. "Could save your life up here." She set aside her sewing and followed him outside. The cold air bit at her cheeks as Silas led her to a clearing near the cabin. He'd set up several wooden stumps at varying distances, their flat tops dusted with fresh snow. "First rule," he said, holding the rifle carefully, "always treat it like it's loaded." His big hands moved surely as he demonstrated how to check the barrel, load the powder, and set the percussion cap. Eleanor watched intently, noting every detail. "Your turn," he said, offering her the weapon. The rifle felt heavy and awkward in her hands. Silas stood close, adjusting her grip and showing her how to brace it against her shoulder. His voice remained steady as he explained each step. "Take your time," he murmured. "Breathe easy. Line up the sight with your target, that nearest stump there." Eleanor tried to follow his instructions, but her arms trembled from the rifle's weight. When she squeezed the trigger, the explosion shocked her. The kick slammed into her shoulder, and she stumbled backward. Silas caught her elbow, steadying her. "Missed," he said, but without mockery. "That's natural first time. Try again?" Eleanor nodded, determined. Her shoulder ached, but she lifted the rifle once more. This time she braced herself better, remembering Silas's lessons about stance and breathing. The second shot went wide too, but the third clipped the edge of the stump, sending splinters flying. "Better?" Silas said, and she caught the hint of a smile in his voice. "Much better." They practiced until Eleanor's arms felt like a lead, but she managed to hit the target several more times. Each success built her confidence. By the time they finished, she understood the basics of loading, aiming, and firing, though she knew it would take much more practice to become truly proficient. Back in the cabin, Eleanor stirred the stew and added more vegetables while Silas cleaned the rifle. The familiar tasks felt different now, weighted with new meaning. She wasn't just keeping house. She was building a life where she could defend herself and contribute fully. Darkness fell early, as it did these winter days. They had just settled down to supper when a soft knock sounded at the door. Eleanor tensed, her hand automatically reaching for the rifle before she saw Silas's calm expression. "Come in, Henry," he called out. The door opened, bringing a swirl of snow and a tall figure wrapped in thick furs. Henry, their Ute neighbor, stomped snow from his boots before stepping inside. His dark eyes took in the scene: the warm hearth, the cooking pot, Eleanor's steady presence at the table. "Welcome," Eleanor said, surprising herself with how natural it felt to greet this man she'd never met. "There's plenty of stew if you're hungry." Henry nodded graciously. "Much obliged." His English was clear, his voice deep and measured. He accepted the bowl she offered, settling on a stool near the fire. "What brings you through this weather?" Silas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Henry sipped his stew before answering. "Surveyors in the valley, railroad men, marking lines on maps." He glanced at Eleanor, including her in the conversation. "They speak of new tracks coming through these parts." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "Near our creek?" "The water draws them," Henry confirmed. "And the land here, it rides the edge of treaty boundaries. My people watch carefully where lines are drawn." Eleanor leaned forward, asking careful questions about the surveyor's movements and timing. Henry answered each query directly, his initial reserve warming as he recognized her genuine concern and intelligence. "You show courage," he said finally, asking hard questions instead of hiding from them. "This is our home," Eleanor replied simply. "We need to protect it." Henry's dark eyes studied her face. "Yes," he said softly. You understand? He turned to Silas. She is good partner for mountain life. Sees clear, thinks strong. Silas nodded, pride evident in his expression. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at their approval, so different from the mockery she'd known in town. After finishing his stew, Henry rose to leave despite their offers to stay the night. My family waits, he explained, but I will watch the surveyors. Bring word if trouble comes. He wrapped himself in his furs and stepped out into the snowy darkness. Eleanor stood at the window, watching until Henry's figure disappeared into the swirling white. The weight of responsibility settled over her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Their peaceful mountain life felt suddenly fragile, threatened by men with maps and money. We must be ready, she said, turning to Silas. Ready to defend what's ours, properly and legally. Yes, Silas's face was grave in the firelight. But we won't face it alone. Henry's friendship is worth more than gold up here. Eleanor moved to bank the fire for the night, then paused. Something stirred in her heart, a need she hadn't felt since her mother's death. Would you pray with me? Silas looked startled, then deeply moved. I'd be honored. They knelt together by the hearth, the firelight casting long shadows on the log walls. Eleanor's voice trembled at first, then grew stronger as she asked for guidance and protection. Silas's deeper tones joined hers, their words twining together like smoke rising from the chimney. As they rose from their knees, Eleanor felt steadier. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, armed with more than just rifles and legal papers. They had built something precious here, a home, a partnership, a shared faith. She watched Silas move about the cabin, securing things for the night, and knew with certainty that she would fight to protect this life they were creating. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain in pristine white. The creek sang beneath its icy cover, reminding them of all they stood to lose and all they had gained. Eleanor touched the curtain she had sewn, feeling the soft fabric beneath her work-roughened fingers. In just a week, she had learned to mend, to cook, to shoot, to stand tall before strangers. She was no longer the woman who had been dragged before the town's jeering crowd. She was becoming someone new, a mountain woman, strong enough to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, frost painting delicate patterns on the cabin windows. Eleanor stood before the small mirror Silas had mounted on the wall, smoothing the fabric of her new dress. She had sewn it herself over the past week, using the plain brown cloth they'd bought in town. Unlike the tight, ill-fitting dress her father had forced her to wear, this one embraced her figure naturally, neither hiding nor mocking her shape. Reckon we should head to town for service, Silas said over breakfast, his voice casual but his eyes watchful. Show folks we ain't hiding up here. Eleanor's hands stilled on her cup. The thought of facing the townspeople again made her stomach clench, but she straightened her shoulders. Yes, she agreed. We should. Silas hitched the mule to the wagon while Eleanor wrapped a loaf of cornbread for their midday meal. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they started down the mountain trail. Eleanor sat tall beside Silas, her new dress warm beneath her wool coat. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they descended through the pines. You look fine, Silas said quietly, noting her fingers worrying at her skirt, natural-like. Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. Thank you, she murmured. The small town came into view around mid-morning. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the chapel bell began to toll, calling folks to worship. Eleanor's heart quickened as Silas guided the wagon down the main street. A few early churchgoers turned to stare, but their expressions held more surprise than malice. Silas helped Eleanor down from the wagon, his strong hands steady at her waist. Together they walked toward the white-painted chapel. Lamplight glowed in its windows, and the sound of gathering voices drifted out. Eleanor held her head high as they stepped through the door. A ripple of whispers swept through the congregation. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares but kept her eyes forward, following Silas to an empty pew near the back. The wooden bench creaked as they Saturday. She could hear fragments of murmured conversations. Changed. Mountain Man's woman. Looks different. The organ wheezed to life, and Preacher Davies called them to worship. Eleanor found herself reaching for the worn hymnal, its familiar pages comforting beneath her fingers. As the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the chapel, she drew in a deep breath. Her voice rose clear and strong, surprising even herself. Years of singing to herself while doing chores had given her a true, sweet tone. The familiar words poured out with genuine feeling. Was blind, but now I see. Heads turned at the sound of her voice. Eleanor kept singing, her confidence growing with each verse. She saw Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, nod approvingly. Even crusty old Mr. Peterson seemed to soften as he listened. Through the service, Eleanor felt herself relaxing. Preacher Davies spoke of perseverance and faith, his words seeming to reach directly to her heart. When he read from the book of Ruth, about finding family in unexpected places, Eleanor felt Silas shift beside her. After the final hymn, people began to file out. Eleanor braced herself, but the atmosphere had changed. Several women smiled tentatively as they passed. A few of the men touched their hat brims respectfully to Silas. No one jeered or whispered behind their hands. Preacher Davies approached them as the chapel emptied. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he looked at Eleanor. "It does my heart good to see you here, Miss May," he said warmly. "The Lord honors those who stand firm in their faith." "Thank you, preacher," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "It means much to hear that." "You have a gift," he added, nodding toward the hymnal she still held. "Your voice brings glory to God's house." Eleanor clutched the book tighter, touched by his words. "I'd like to come again," she said. "If we're welcome." "Always," the preacher assured her. "This is God's house, open to all who seek him." As they stepped out into the winter sunshine, Eleanor noticed more changes. Where once there had been mockery, now she saw curiosity in the townspeople's faces. Several men tipped their hats as they passed. Mrs. Miller even stopped to compliment Eleanor's dress. "Did you make it yourself, dear?" she asked, fingering the neat seams. "Fine work." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor replied. "Thank you." The ride back up the mountain seemed lighter somehow. The sun had warmed the air, and patches of snow glittered like diamonds in the meadows they passed. Eleanor felt a peculiar peace settling in her heart. "You've changed how they see you," Silas remarked as they wound their way higher. Eleanor considered this. "Maybe how I see myself," she replied thoughtfully. "I'm not what my father said I was." Silas nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. They rode on in comfortable silence, the mule's hooves clopping steadily against the frozen ground. Back at the cabin, Eleanor set about making supper while Silas tended to the mule. She mixed flour and water, adding the precious yeast they'd bought in town. As she kneaded the dough, she thought about how different her hands looked now. Stronger, more capable, marked with small scars from learning mountain work. The cabin filled with the warm smell of baking bread as the loaf rose in the oven. Eleanor had tried several times before to bake bread successfully, but something had always gone wrong. Too dense, too dry, or burned on the bottom. This time felt different. When she pulled the golden brown loaf from the oven, pride swelled in her chest. The crust crackled perfectly under her fingers, and the inside was light and tender. Silas came in from chopping wood, bringing a blast of cold air with him. "Smells like heaven," he said, hanging up his coat. They sat together at the rough-hewn table, steam rising from the fresh-cut bread. Eleanor said grace, thanking God for their food and their home. The first bite melted in her mouth, and she couldn't help smiling. "First perfect loaf," she said happily. "Worth waiting for," Silas agreed, reaching for another piece. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the distant howl of wolves down from the higher peaks. But inside the cabin, warmth and contentment reigned. Eleanor caught herself humming one of the hymns from church as she cleared the table, and Silas joined in with his deeper voice. Laughter bubbled up unexpectedly. Not the bitter kind she'd known before, but something light and joyful. The sound filled the cabin like sunshine, and Silas's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled back at her. This place that had once seemed like a prison now felt like sanctuary. The rough walls held not confinement but protection. The simple furniture and homemade curtains spoke not of poverty but of honest work and care. Even the howling wolves seemed less threatening now, just another voice in the mountain night. Eleanor stood at the window, watching darkness settle over their mountain. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman she was beginning to recognize, someone strong, capable, worthy of respect. The lamplight cast a warm glow around her, and for the first time, she truly felt at home. The winter storms descended with fierce intensity, transforming the mountain landscape into a white wilderness. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and bitter winds howled through the pines like hungry wolves. Inside, Eleanor and Silas fell into the steady rhythm of survival. Each morning began before dawn. Eleanor would wake to the sound of Silas already moving about, stoking the dying embers in the hearth back to life. The cabin's single room would be bitter cold until the fire caught properly. She'd wrap herself in a quilt, watching her breath mist in the dim light as she helped kindle the flames. "Going to be another hard one," Silas would often say, peering through the frosted window pane at the gray sky. Eleanor learned to read the weather in his face, in the way his eyes narrowed at certain clouds or how he rubbed his scarred hands when snow was coming. Their days blended together in an endless cycle of essential tasks. Hauling wood became Eleanor's constant labor. She'd trudge through deep snow to the woodpile, her arms aching as she carried load after load to keep the hearth fed. The work strengthened her, and she found pride in her growing endurance. Caring for the livestock proved even more challenging. Their small barn housed 2 milk cows, the mule, and a few chickens. Every morning and evening, they had to break ice in the water troughs and ensure the animals had enough feed. Eleanor learned to milk with frozen fingers, singing hymns under her breath to keep her spirits up while the cows patiently stood in their stalls. "You've got away with them," Silas remarked one morning, watching her gentle handling of the animals. "They trust you." Eleanor smiled, remembering how frightened she'd been of the large beasts when she first arrived. Now they were like family, dependent on her care to survive the winter. The morning everything changed, started like any other. Eleanor was preparing breakfast, the smell of coffee and frying cornmeal mush filling the cabin, when Silas suddenly stiffened at the window. "Smoke," he said sharply, grabbing his coat. "And not from any chimney." Eleanor followed his gaze. Dark smoke rose against the pale sky, coming from the direction of their corral. Her heart clenched with fear as she hurried to dress for the cold. They found the corral smoldering, several posts charred black and still smoking in the snow. The gate lay broken, and boot prints led away into the trees. Their livestock, thankfully, had been safely in the barn, but the message was clear. This was no accident. Silas cursed under his breath, his face dark with anger. "Ranchers," he said grimly, striking back for the water claim. Eleanor touched one of the burned posts, feeling the lingering heat through her mittens. "How could they?" she whispered, but she knew the answer. Water meant everything out here, and some men would stop at nothing to control it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense, but it was Henry who appeared through the trees, leading a horse loaded with timber. The Ute Scout's face was grave as he surveyed the damage. "Saw the smoke?" he said simply. "Brought wood to help rebuild." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this kindness. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. They worked through the morning, clearing away the damaged posts and setting new ones. Henry's knowledge proved invaluable, showing them how to sink the posts deeper to prevent future sabotage. Eleanor helped where she could, holding posts steady and mixing snow with ash to mark the new boundary line. As they worked, Eleanor found herself reciting scripture that her mother had taught her long ago. "The Lord is my strength and my shield," she quoted, her voice carrying over the sound of their labor. "In him my heart trusts, and I am helped." Silas paused in his work, listening. Henry nodded approvingly. The ancient words seemed to give them all renewed purpose, and the work went faster. That evening, after Henry had departed with their heartfelt thanks, Eleanor took out the family Bible. Its leather cover was worn smooth with age, the pages soft from years of turning. By lamplight, she began to read aloud, her voice steady and clear in the quiet cabin. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," she read, feeling the power of the familiar words. "For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Silas sat in his chair by the fire, his face softened in the flickering light. His eyes never left Eleanor as she read, and something unspoken passed between them, warm as the hearth fire and just as sustaining. Their moment of peace was shattered the next day when a rider arrived, his horse breathing hard from the climb. He carried a letter that made Eleanor's hands shake as she read it. "Our water claim is being contested," she said, her voice hollow. "They're saying we have no right to the creek." Her eyes scanned further down the page, and she gasped. "My father. He's signed with them. He's supporting the rancher's claim. Silas crossed the room in 2 strides, taking the letter from her trembling hands. His jaw tightened as he read, but his voice remained gentle. "Your father's chosen his side," he said quietly, "but that don't make him right." Eleanor sank into a chair, reeling from the betrayal. Her father had always been harsh, but this, siding with those who would destroy their home, cut deeper than she'd imagined possible. "How could he?" she whispered. "His own daughter. Pride's a powerful thing," Silas said, kneeling beside her chair. "Makes men do terrible things sometimes, but you're stronger than his hate, Eleanor. You've proved that every day since you came here." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks, but she straightened her shoulders. "What do? We do now?" "We fight," Silas said simply. "Legal-like, through proper channels, but we don't give up what's rightfully ours." Eleanor nodded, wiping her eyes. "Then we should pray," she said firmly, "for courage and for wisdom." Together they knelt beside the hearth, their clasped hands warm between them. Eleanor's voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she prayed, asking for guidance and strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes drifting silently past the window. The fresh powder gradually covered the scorched earth around the corral, hiding the scars of violence beneath its pure white blanket. But beneath that peaceful surface, both Eleanor and Silas knew trouble was brewing like a mountain storm. The letter lay on the table, its official script declaring war on their quiet life. Yet as Eleanor rose from prayer, she felt a curious calm. Her father's betrayal hurt deeply, but it also freed her in a way she hadn't expected. The last ties to her old life were severed, leaving her free to fight for this new one she'd built with Silas. She moved to the window, watching the snow erase all signs of the morning's violence. Silas came to stand beside her, his solid presence reassuring. Together they watched darkness settle over their mountain home, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but facing them together. The lamp burned low as night deepened, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Eleanor added another log to the fire, listening to the wind's mournful song through the pines. Despite everything, the threat to their home, her father's betrayal, the rancher's violence, she felt oddly peaceful. This cabin, this life with Silas, was worth fighting for. Whatever came next, they would face it standing side by side. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Silas prepared to ride into town. Eleanor watched him check his saddlebags, her heart heavy with worry. "I need those land office records," he explained, buckling his gun belt. "Proof that our claim was filed first, before the ranchers started making trouble." Eleanor nodded, wringing her hands. "Be careful," she said softly. "Rancher Briggs and his men won't take kindly to you poking around." "I'll be back before dark," Silas promised, his scarred hand gentle on her shoulder. "Keep the rifle loaded, just in case. Remember what I taught you." Eleanor touched the Winchester rifle propped by the door, remembering their practice sessions. The weight of it still felt strange in her hands, but she could hit a target now, thanks to Silas's patient teaching. After he rode away, Eleanor tried to keep busy with chores. She fed the chickens, hauled water from the creek, and swept the cabin floor. But her eyes kept straying to the window, watching the path that led down to town. As afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor's anxiety grew. Silas should have returned by now. She paced the cabin, jumping at every sound. The coffee pot bubbled on the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. The sun was setting when she heard it, the thunder of approaching hooves, too many for just one rider. Eleanor's heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed the rifle, checking that it was loaded just as Silas had shown her. Through the window, she counted at least 6 riders approaching the cabin. Their shapes were dark against the purple dusk, but she recognized Rancher Briggs's distinctive hat. These weren't friendly visitors. "Come on out, girl," one of the men shouted. "We just want to talk about that water claim." Eleanor's hands trembled on the rifle, but she remembered Silas's words. "Stand your ground. Show them you're not afraid, even if you are." She stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. "That's close enough," she called out, proud that her voice didn't shake. The men laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "Look at that," Briggs sneered. "The fat girl thinks she can shoot." Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. She aimed high. just as Silas had taught her, and squeezed. The rifle's report cracked through the evening air like thunder. A branch splintered above the men's heads, making their horses dance nervously. "Next shot won't be a warning," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. Inside, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The men's laughter died. They hadn't expected her to actually fire. Briggs's face darkened with anger. "You'll regret that, girl," he growled, starting to dismount. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension. "She is not alone." Henry stepped out of the shadows, his bow drawn. The arrow pointed straight at Briggs's chest. The Ute Scout's presence seemed to fill the clearing with dangerous energy. The ranchers shifted uneasily. They might mock a woman, but Henry's reputation as a warrior was well known. No one wanted to test his aim. "This ain't over," Briggs spat, but he remounted his horse. "Tell Boone we'll be seeing him soon." Eleanor kept the rifle steady until the last rider disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did her legs give out, and she sank onto the porch steps, shaking. Henry lowered his bow. "You did well," he said quietly. "But where is Silas?" "He should have been back hours ago," Eleanor whispered, fresh fear gripping her heart. "He went to town for documents." "I will look for him," Henry said, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. Eleanor paced the cabin, torn between fear and fury. The coffee went cold on the stove, untouched. She jumped at every sound, praying it would be Silas returning safely. Hours passed. The moon had risen when she finally heard a horse approaching, a single rider, moving slowly. Eleanor rushed outside with the lamp, her heart stopping at what its light revealed. Silas slumped in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood. "Eleanor," he managed to say, before starting to slide sideways. She caught on him somehow, her fear giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Supporting his weight, she helped him into the cabin and onto their bed. "Ambushed?" he groaned as she carefully peeled back his shirt. 3 of them, waiting on the road. "Don't talk," Eleanor commanded, fighting back panic as she saw the ugly wound in his shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, but the bleeding was bad. Her hands shook as she gathered supplies. Clean cloths, her sewing kit, the bottle of whiskey they kept for medicine. She'd helped birth calves and mend injured farmhands before, but this was different. This was Silas. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she poured whiskey over the wound. Silas's body jerked, but he didn't cry out. Eleanor cleaned the injury as best she could, her tears falling silently as she worked. The bullet wound needed stitching. Eleanor threaded her smallest needle, remembering her mother's lessons about neat, even stitches. "Please, God," she prayed, "guide my hands." Silas remained conscious through it all, his breathing harsh but controlled. When she finally tied off the last stitch, he managed a weak smile. "You've got steady hands," he murmured. Eleanor bound his shoulder with clean strips torn from one of her petticoats. The white cloth slowly stained red, but the bleeding had slowed. She helped him drink some water, then settled into the chair beside the bed. "Sleep," she told him firmly. "I'll keep watch." Through the long night, Eleanor kept the lamp burning. She changed Silas's bandages twice, each time praying the bleeding would stop completely. She bathed his face when fever threatened, singing hymns softly to comfort them both. Every sound from outside made her reach for the rifle, but no more riders came. Perhaps Henry's presence had warned them off, or maybe they thought they'd accomplished enough for one night. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Silas's fever broke. His eyes opened, clearer now, and found Eleanor, still sitting beside him. "You saved my life," he said hoarsely. Eleanor blushed, exhaustion making her dizzy. "You'd have done the same for me. You protected our home," Silas continued. "Stood against those men. You're braver than you know, Eleanor." His words, spoke with such quiet conviction, brought fresh tears to her eyes. She hadn't felt brave. She'd been terrified every moment, but she'd done what needed doing, just as he'd taught her. "Rest now," she said softly, but Silas had already drifted back to sleep, his breathing steadier than before. Eleanor meant to keep watching, but exhaustion finally overcame her. She slumped in the chair, her hand still resting near Silas's on the bed. The rising sun painted the cabin walls gold. while outside, birds began their morning songs. The rifle stayed close at hand, but for now, at least, there was peace. The last thing Eleanor saw before sleep claimed her was Silas's face, peaceful in the dawn light. Despite everything, the attack, the wound, the long night of fear, they had survived together. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it the same way. In the quiet cabin, their gentle breathing mingled with the crackle of the dying fire. The lamp burned low, its light no longer needed, as morning crept in through the windows. Eleanor's head nodded forward, and finally, she allowed herself to rest. The days after the attack blurred together like watercolors in rain. Eleanor moved through them in a steady rhythm of duty and care. Her world narrowed to the four walls of their cabin, and the wounded man who lay within. Silas's fever rose and fell like the tide. Eleanor changed his bandages 3 times each day, carefully cleaning the wound and applying fresh poultices of herbs she gathered from their dwindling winter stores. Her hands grew steady with practice, though her heart still clenched each time she saw the angry red flesh around the stitches. The morning chores seemed heavier without Silas's help. Eleanor trudged through knee-deep snow to feed the livestock, her breath frosting in the bitter air. She chopped wood until her arms trembled, remembering how patient Silas had been teaching her the proper swing. The water bucket seemed to grow heavier with each trip to the creek, but she forced herself to make extra journeys, knowing Silas needed clean water to heal. On the 4th day, as she stirred a pot of thin soup, her father's cruel words echoed in her mind. Too fat to feed, too lazy to work. The wooden spoon trembled in her grip. What if he had been right? What if she wasn't strong enough to keep them alive through this? Eleanor? Silas's voice, though weak, cut through her darkness like a blade through silk. She turned to find him watching her with concerned eyes. You should be resting, she scolded but moved to sit beside him. Silas reached for her hand with his good arm. You're not mine to be given, he said softly, as if reading the doubt in her heart. You're God's, and your own. Eleanor's breath caught. In all her 20 years, no one had ever spoken to her like that, as if she belonged to herself first. The words seemed to kindle something inside her, a warm flame of purpose that burned away her father's shadows. That afternoon, she made a decision. Wrapping herself in her warmest shawl and gathering her courage like a cloak, Eleanor saddled their most reliable horse. Silas watched from his bed, worry creasing his brow. Henry will know what to do, she assured him, though her voice quavered. I'll be careful. The ride to Henry's camp tested every lesson Silas had taught her about winter survival. The wind cut like knives through her clothes, and the horse picked its way carefully through treacherous snow. Eleanor's thighs ached from gripping the saddle, but she pressed on, following the landmarks Henry had once pointed out. She found the Ute camp tucked into a sheltered valley. Henry emerged from his lodge as she approached, his face grave but unsurprised. He helped her dismount and led her to the fire, where his wife wrapped her in a warm blanket and pressed a cup of hot tea into her trembling hands. The ranchers grow bold, Henry said, once she had thawed enough to speak. They think because Silas is wounded, you will run. Eleanor shook her head firmly. We won't run, but I need to know. Will your people stand with us when the agency reviews our claim? Henry was silent for a long moment, studying her face. You are not the same woman who arrived with Silas, he said finally. Then, you were like a bird with broken wings. Now you fly on your own. The ranchers broke more than my spirit when they shot Silas, Eleanor replied, her voice steady. They broke their own honor. Someone must stand for what's right. A slight smile crossed Henry's weathered face. Dignity is defended by action, not hiding, he said. My people will speak truth about the boundaries and the water rights. The agency must listen to all voices, not just those with gold in their pockets. Relief flooded through Eleanor. With Henry's support, their claim would carry more weight. She finished her tea and stood, ready to face the ride home. The return journey seemed easier, as if her burden had lightened. She found Silas awake and worried, but his face relaxed when she told him of Henry's pledge. We won't surrender, she said firmly, stoking the fire back to life. This is our home, and we'll defend it properly, with words and law first, before bullets. That evening, after ensuring Silas was comfortable, Eleanor sat at their rough-hewn table with paper and ink. The lamp cast a warm glow as she carefully drafted their petition to the agency. Her handwriting, once praised by her mother, flowed across the page as she detailed their claim to the water rights. She included everything: dates of Silas's original settlement, careful descriptions of the creek's course through their land, notes about their improvements to the property. She referenced the relevant treaties Henry had mentioned and emphasized their peaceful intentions toward all neighbors. With each paragraph, her confidence grew. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted through force and fear. Silas watched her from his bed, his eyes bright with something more than fever. The woman bent over the petition, her face serious in the lamplight, bore little resemblance to the trembling creature who had climbed into his wagon that autumn day. Eleanor had found her strength, like gold hidden in plain rock. "Read it to me?" he asked softly. Eleanor brought the lamp closer to his bed and read the petition aloud, her voice growing stronger with each carefully chosen word. When she finished, Silas reached for her hand. "You've done more than I ever dreamed," he said quietly. "When I stopped your father that day, I hoped to save you from cruelty. Instead, you've saved us both." Eleanor blushed but didn't look away. "You gave me the chance to find myself," she replied. "Now I aim to prove worthy of it." Outside their cabin, the storm that had raged for days finally broke. The clouds parted like a curtain drawn back, revealing a sky strewn with stars. They blazed cold and bright, countless diamonds scattered on black velvet, bearing witness to the strength that had grown in the woman below. Eleanor added her signature to the petition, the ink glistening in the lamplight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this moment, she knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. No one, not her father, not the ranchers, not even her own doubts, could take that away from her again. The morning they planned to leave dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the mountain slopes. Eleanor carefully wrapped extra bandages and herbs in oilcloth, tucking them into her saddlebag. Though Silas's wound was healing well, she wouldn't risk the long journey without medical supplies. "You don't have to come," Silas said from where he sat at the table, his voice still carrying traces of weakness. "I can manage the ride." Eleanor shook her head firmly as she packed dried meat and hard biscuits. "We do this together," she said. "The agency needs to see both of us. Besides, you're not yet strong enough to travel alone." Silas didn't argue, but his eyes held warmth as he watched her efficient movements around the cabin. When Henry arrived with 3 other Ute riders, Eleanor had everything prepared: provisions, documents, and spare blankets all carefully stowed. "The passes are deep with snow," Henry warned as they secured the last bundles. "We will take the lower trail, slower, but safer." Eleanor helped Silas mount, watching carefully for any sign of pain. His jaw tightened, but he settled into the saddle without complaint. She swung up onto her own horse, patting its neck as the animal shifted restlessly. The small party set out just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. Henry led the way, with 2 riders flanking Silas and Eleanor while the 3rd brought up the rear. Their horses' hooves crunched through the crusty snow, sending up small clouds of crystalline powder with each step. They rode in silence through the morning, saving their breath for the thin mountain air. Eleanor kept close watch on Silas, noting how he sat straighter as the hours passed, his strength returning bit by bit. When they stopped to rest the horses at midday, she insisted on checking his bandages. "You've become quite the healer," he remarked as she gently probed the wound. "I had a good teacher in watching you tend injured animals," she replied, applying fresh herbs before rewrapping his shoulder. "Though I pray I won't need these skills again soon." That evening, they made camp in a sheltered grove of pines. The Ute riders efficiently set up a temporary shelter while Eleanor prepared a simple meal. As they sat around the fire, steam rising from tin cups of coffee, Henry spoke of the boundaries they would cross tomorrow. Land that had belonged to his people before treaties drew new lines across ancient hunting grounds. "The agency men forget sometimes," he said, "that water flows where it will, not where papers say it should." His dark eyes met Eleanor's across the flames. "But they remember when reminded properly." Eleanor nodded, understanding his meaning. The petition in her saddlebag carried more than just their claim. It carried the weight of truth about the land itself. That night, as the fire burned low and the others slept, Eleanor sat beside Silas's bedroll. The moon cast silver light through the pine boughs, making the snow glow faintly. "I never thought I'd be proud to be shot," Silas said quietly, reaching for her hand. "But watching you these past weeks, it was worth it." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "I never thought I'd be proud of myself," she whispered back. "You gave me that gift." "No." He shook his head slightly. "You always had it in you. You just needed someone to see it." They traveled for 3 more days, moving carefully through valleys and along ridgelines. The Ute riders proved invaluable guides, finding sheltered camping spots and breaking trail through deep drifts. Eleanor's respect for them grew with each passing hour, seeing how they read the land and weather like she read words on a page. Finally, on the afternoon of the 4th day, they crested a rise and saw the agency building below, a solid structure of squared logs with a proper shingled roof, smoke rising from its chimney. Eleanor's heart began to pound as they descended the last slope. This was the moment all their preparation led to. The clerk looked up in surprise as they entered, snow melting from their coats. His eyes widened further when Eleanor stepped forward, drawing the petition from her leather folder. "Sir," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "we've come about our water claim on Crow Creek. I have our documentation here, including survey marks and witness statements." The clerk blinked, clearly unused to such direct address from a woman, but Eleanor pressed on, laying out their papers on his desk. She pointed to specific passages, explaining their long residence and improvements to the land. When she mentioned Henry's support and knowledge of the original boundaries, the clerk's attention sharpened. "The ranchers claim that land was never properly settled," he said, shuffling through their papers. "They say it's open range." "They're wrong," Eleanor replied firmly. She pulled out a carefully drawn map. "Silas has worked that creek for 8 years. We have signatures from 3 different trappers who traded with him there, all dated and witnessed. And here," she indicated a section of the petition, "are notes about the original treaty lines, showing our cabin sits just within the settlement zone." Silas added his quiet testimony about the years he'd spent developing the water source, his voice carrying the weight of experience. But Eleanor could see it was her organized presentation and clear writing that caught the clerk's attention. He spent several minutes examining their documents, comparing dates and details. "This is unusually well prepared," he admitted finally. "Most claims come in scratched on wrinkled paper, half the facts missing." He looked up at Eleanor with new respect. "Where did you learn to write legal documents?" "My mother taught me reading and writing," Eleanor said. "She believed education was important, even on the frontier, and I've studied every land notice and legal paper I could find since then." The clerk nodded slowly. "Well, this certainly warrants a proper hearing. The circuit judge arrives next week. I'll schedule you for Thursday morning." He made a note in his ledger. "Be prepared for the ranchers to contest everything." "We're prepared," Eleanor assured him, gathering their papers carefully. "Truth speaks for itself, if given a voice." They took a small room above the general store for the night, the only lodging available in the tiny settlement. A single lamp cast warm light across the rough wooden walls as Eleanor sat at the room's small table, reviewing their documents one more time. Silas watched her from where he sat on the narrow bed, his injured arm cradled carefully. "You were magnificent today," he said softly. "Like you were born to speak in front of officials." Eleanor's hands stilled on the papers. She remembered that terrible day in town, her father's cruel voice offering her to the crowd. The memory no longer had the power to break her. "I was born to be myself," she said quietly. "It just took me a while to find out who that was." Silas rose carefully and crossed to her side. His large hand covered hers where it rested on the petition, warm and steady. No words were needed. His touch carried all his faith in her, in them, in the path they'd chosen together. Outside their window, snow began falling again, soft and steady in the darkness. But inside, in the lamp's gentle glow, Eleanor felt only warmth and certainty. Whatever the hearing might bring, she was ready. She had found her voice, and she would use it to defend their home, their dignity, and their future. The lamp flickered as she sorted the papers into careful order for tomorrow. Each document represented a piece of their story, not just the legal claim to water rights, but the deeper truth of how 2 wounded souls had found healing in the wilderness, and how justice could grow from the seeds of respect and understanding. Silas squeezed her hand gently, and in that quiet gesture lay a world of unspoken promises. They would face whatever came together, standing tall before any challenge. Eleanor had journeyed so far from that humiliated woman in the town square, not just in miles, but in spirit. She was ready to show the world exactly who she had become. The agency hall buzzed with tension as Eleanor stood before the officials. Ranchers filled the back rows, their sneers visible even in the dim light. Her father, Samuel May, sat among them, his face twisted with familiar contempt. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped her papers, but then she remembered her morning prayers, for strength, for wisdom, for grace. Taking a deep breath, she began speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. Water flows as God intended, bringing life to all who respect its gift. This creek isn't meant to be hoarded by the wealthy or used as a weapon against the poor. It's a blessing meant to be shared, tended with care, not greed. The room fell silent. Even the shuffling of boots stilled as she continued, describing their stewardship of the land, their peaceful relations with Ute neighbors, their improvements to the water flow. Silas, standing tall despite his healing wound, added only a brief statement about his years of residence, letting Eleanor's eloquent defense carry their cause. Samuel May stood suddenly, his chair scraping loud against the wooden floor. "She's nothing but a fat shame to our name," he spat. "No proper daughter would." Eleanor turned to face him, her spine straight. "I am a woman chosen by God," she declared clearly, "not traded by men." Her words rang through the stunned silence as gasps rippled through the crowd. The officials quickly called for order, announcing they would consider all testimony before making their decision. As people filed out, Eleanor heard townsfolk whispering with newfound admiration. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit soared. Outside, Silas touched her arm gently. "You spoke like fire," he murmured, pride gleaming in his eyes. That evening at Henry's camp, Ute women welcomed them with bowls of fragrant stew and soft songs rising in the firelight. Eleanor sat among them, wrapped in a gifted blanket, feeling their acceptance warm her heart. For the first time in her life, she knew what it meant to be truly honored, not for her size or status, but for the strength of her spirit. The letter arrived on a crisp winter morning, brought by a rider whose horse's hooves crunched through fresh snow. Eleanor's hands shook as she unfolded the official parchment. As she read the agency's words, tears welled in her eyes. Their water rights were confirmed, their claim recognized in full. "We won," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "The creek is ours, legally and properly." Silas, his wounded arm still bound but healing, crossed the cabin in 2 long strides. He lifted her with his good arm, spinning her in a joyful embrace as sunlight streamed through the windows. The agency's decision, bolstered by Henry's testimony about their respectful stewardship, left the ranchers no ground to stand on. Henry himself led their escort home, his quiet pride evident in his bearing. The site of their cabin, though bearing scars from the ranchers' attacks, stood firm against the mountain backdrop. Eleanor touched the rough-hewn logs with newfound ownership and gratitude. Over the following days, neighbors who had stayed neutral during the conflict began stopping by. They brought tools, lumber, and willing hands to help rebuild the damaged fence lines. Each post set felt like another victory, another step toward healing. When Sunday came, Eleanor and Silas attended service together. The preacher's voice rang clear through the chapel. "Let us celebrate those who stand for justice with courage and faith. Eleanor May has become a blessing to this valley, showing us the power of dignity and perseverance." Faces that once twisted with mockery now smiled in genuine welcome. Hands reached out in friendship rather than scorn. That evening, Eleanor and Silas shared a quiet supper by their hearth. The lamplight caught the tenderness in their shared glances. Outside, snow drifted silently against the window panes, but inside, warmth and peace filled every corner. Eleanor felt the truth of it deep in her bones. She was not a woman traded away in shame, but one chosen in love. Not an object of mockery, but a person worthy of honor. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Eleanor and Silas walked beside the creek. Ice melted along its banks, releasing crystalline drops into the rushing flow below. Their boots crunched through patches of snow, hands clasped together as they paused to watch the waters dance. "There's something I need to tell you," Silas said softly, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "That day in town, when your father..." He squeezed her hand gently. My plan was never about owning anyone. I saw someone precious being treated as worthless, and I knew God had a greater purpose for you. Eleanor's eyes glistened as she turned to face him. I was so afraid that first day, she admitted. But now I understand. You didn't just give me shelter. You helped me find my own strength. A smile warmed her face, and along the way, I found love too. Together, they knelt beside the creek. The sound of rushing water merged with their quiet prayers, giving thanks for the land that had become their home, the water that sustained life, and the new beginning they had found together. Their words rose like mist into the morning air, full of gratitude and hope. Returning to the cabin, they saw lamplight already glowing through the windows, welcoming them home. Inside, Eleanor began preparing bread dough, her movements sure and confident now. The familiar scent of yeast filled the air as she worked. Through the window, she watched Silas splitting wood, his axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. As evening approached, the sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves drew their attention. Henry arrived first, his dark eyes warm with friendship. Behind him came neighbors. Faces that had once turned away now brightened with genuine welcome. They carried gifts, preserved fruit, warm quilts, even a young apple tree for spring planting. The cabin that had once felt so isolated now buzzed with community. Women shared recipes with Eleanor while men discussed spring planting with Silas. Henry sat near the hearth, sharing stories of his people's connection to the land. Children played in the corners, their laughter mixing with adult conversation. As darkness settled outside, someone began to sing. The hymn spread through the gathered folk, voices rising in harmony. Amazing Grace filled every corner of the cabin, and Eleanor's clear voice joined in, strong and unashamed. When the last notes faded, Eleanor stepped to the cabin's doorway. She gazed out at the snow-covered peaks, their majesty crowned by stars. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Her heart swelled with quiet joy. Here, in this place where she had once felt cast aside, she stood tall, a woman of worth, a partner in love, surrounded by fellowship. Faith had led her through the darkest valley to this moment of grace, and hope illuminated the path ahead like the stars above the mountains. Behind her, the cabin glowed with warmth and friendship, voices still murmuring in peaceful conversation. She lifted her face to the night sky, offering one more silent prayer of gratitude for the remarkable journey that had brought her home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.